then compel your marionettes from the Kiev regime to implement them, and please, or stop saying that there is no alternative to them. I thank you for your attention.
За ее брифинг.
I thank Ms. Татьяна Мончан for her briefing.
Сейчас я сделаю заявление в своем качестве заместителя министра иностранных дел Российской Федерации. Хотели бы поблагодарить за высказанные оценки заместителя генсекретаря ООН Розмари Ди Карло, спецпредставителя действующего представителя ОБСЕ в Минской контактной группе Ника Кинунина и главу специальной мониторинговой миссии ОБСЕ Халита Чевика. Признательны госпоже Татьяне Мончан за ценную весьма информацию из первых рук о том, как реализуется на практике решение Совета Безопасности ООН по урегулированию внутриукраинского конфликта. Дата сегодняшнего заседания выбрана нами не случайно. В этот день, 7 лет назад, Совет Безопасности ООН в своей резолюции 2202 единодушно утвердил комплекс мер по выполнению Минских соглашений в качестве единственной международно-правовой основы регулирования гражданского конфликта на востоке Украины. Именно поэтому основной задачей сегодняшней встречи мы видим подтверждение Совета Безопасности безальтернативности этого судьбоносного для Украины документа. К сожалению, спустя 7 лет у нас появляется все больше оснований полагать, что реализация Минского комплекса мер, планы наших украинских соседей по-прежнему уходят. Они уже говорят об этом в открытую. Приведу лишь несколько наиболее свежих примеров. Буквально вчера вице-премьер-министр Украины Ирина Верещук утверждала, что никаких новых законов об особом статусе Донбасса, никаких согласований напрямую не будет. И это после разговора Зеленского с канцлером Шольцем. Она, кстати, тогда же призналась, что никакого давления со стороны Запада по выполнению Минска Киев не ощущает. 4 февраля в интервью украинскому телеканалу 1+1 Минотдел Украины Кулеба заявил, что Минские соглашения не могут быть выполнены на российских условиях, к которым он почему-то отнес прямой диалог между Украиной и Донбассом. Хотя это условие четко зафиксировано в комплексе мер. Эту же мысль проводил глава Офиса президента Украины Ермак на недавней встрече политсоветников в нормандском формате. Ранее 2 февраля Кулеба утверждал, что ни один регион Украины не будет иметь права вето на государственное решение. Это высечено в камне, так что никакого особого статуса, как представляет Россия, никакого права вето не будет. Днем ранее, 1 февраля, Зеленский тоже напомнил всему миру о недоговороспособности Украины. Намекая на наличие альтернативного решения конфликта в Донбассе, он сказал, что в Киеве по-разному относятся к порядку выполнения тех или иных пунктов Минских соглашений. 31 января в интервью агентства Associated Press секретарь Совета национальной безопасности и обороны Украины Данилов заявил о том, что выполнение Минских соглашений означает разрушение страны. Когда они были подписаны под дулом русских пушек, а немцы и французы смотрели, всем разумным людям уже было ясно, что реализовать эти документы невозможно. Украинские политики последовательно пытаются укоренить на Западе мнение о том, что Минские соглашения противоречат интересам Украины. Но если задача построения мира на своей земле входит в национальные интересы Украины, подобных утверждений быть не должно. Другая распространенная отговорка подобного рода о том, что якобы некие свои обязательства в Минских соглашениях не выполняет Россия. Не исключаю, что подобные утверждения мы услышим и сегодня. При этом очевидно, что для такой постановки вопроса нет никаких оснований, так как упоминание России в тексте Минских соглашений. Приведу только одно мнение на этот счет, причем не кого-либо, а бывшего судьи Конституционного суда Украины Виктора Шишкина, который недавно предложил открыть уголовные дела против причастных к подписанию Минских соглашений Леонида Кучмы и Петра Порошенко. Последний обвиняется в том, что, цитирую, «Минск предусматривает 20 обязательств для Украины, 6 для ОБСЕ, 2 для Донбасса и ни одного для России». Конец цитаты. Уважаемые коллеги,
End of quote.
Позвольте мне еще раз
Colleagues,
кратко напомнить
please
содержание
allow me to
документа,
yet once again
которому
very
посвящено
briefly
наше сегодняшнее
recall the
заседание.
contents of the document we're
Перечислю его
discussing
по
at this
пунктам,
meeting of ours.
порядок
Let me
выполнения
list it
которых
item
четко
by item,
прописан
and the
и
order
не
in
может
which
быть
they are to be
изменен.
implemented is very clearly
Первое
stated. It cannot
прекращение
be
огня.
changed. First,
Второе отвод
ceasefire.
вооружений.
Second, withdrawal of
Третье
weapons. Three,
мониторинг ОБСЕ.
OC monitoring.
Четвертое
Four,
начало
launching a
диалога Киева
dialogue
с Донбассом.
between Kiev and
Пятое
Donbass.
амнистия.
Five,
Шестое
amnesty.
обмен
Six,
удерживаемыми лицами.
exchange of detainees.
Седьмое
Seven,
гуманитарный доступ.
humanitarian access.
Восьмое отмена
8,
экономической блокады.
lifting the economic
9.
blockade.
Передача Киеву
9,
контроля над
transfer to the
границей, если
Kiev
выполнен
border
пункт
control,
11.
provided
10.
item
Вывод
11
иностранных
is
формирований
implemented.
военных
10,
сил.
withdrawal
11.
of
Новая
foreign formations
конституция,
and mercenaries.
закрепляющая особый
11,
статус
new
Донбасса.
constitutions
12.
providing special
Согласование
status for
порядка
Donbass.
проведения выборов.
12,
И 13.
agreeing on the order of conducting
интенсификация
elections.
работы
And 13,
контактной группы.
intensifying the work of the contact group
Спустя
in Minsk.
7 лет очевидно,
7
ни одно из
years down the
положений
road, it
комплекса
is
мер
clear
Украина
that none of the
Украиной
provisions of the package
полноценно
of
не
measures
выполнена.
have been implemented
Начиная
by
с первого
Ukraine in
пункта
full.
прекращения огня.
Starting with the first one,
Корень проблемы –
ceasefire.
систематическое
And the
нежелание
root of
Киева
the problem
вступать в
here is
прямой диалог
systematic
с
lack of
полномочными
desire of
представителями
Kiev to
Донецка и
get
Луганска в
into a
контактной
direct
группе.
dialogue with the authorized representative of
Это при том,
Donetsk
что
in
такой
Luhansk
диалог
in the
прямо
contact group.
предусматривается пунктами
Whereas
4,
this is a
9,
dialogue that is
11 и
clearly
12 этого
directly
документа.
provided in items
Это
4,
не какое-то
9,
наше
11, and
требование,
12 of the
а
document. This
зафиксированное
is
в
not our
документе
requirement.
обязательство
This is
Украины.
something that
И
is
именно его
stated
наши
in the
соседи все
document. It's
громче
an
ставят под
obligation on
сомнение,
Ukraine. And this is something
рискуют
that
таким
our
образом
neighbors
нарушить весь
increasingly
Минский
bring into
процесс
question
с губительными
and
для Украины последствиями.
thus
Украина
risk
упорно
undermine
отказывается
all
от
Minsk
реализации
process,
положений
which could lead to
комплекса мер о прямом
devastating
диалоге с
consequences for
Донбассом,
Ukraine.
о порядке
Ukraine
временного
stubbornly
самоуправления,
refuses to implement
восстановления
the provisions of the
социально-экономических связей и проведения
Minsk on
конституционной реформы для закрепления
direct
особого
dialogue with
статуса
Donbass,
региона. В
interim
настоящее время в
self-governance,
Верховную Раду внесен несогласованный с Донбассом
restoring socioeconomic
законопроект о
links,
децентрализации,
constitutional
не
reform. And
предусматривающий особого
currently,
статуса
the
региона.
Verkhovная Rada has a draft
Украинская
on
сторона взяла курс на
decentralization. It's
полный
not agreed
отказ от
with
прямого
Donbass and it does
взаимодействия
not
с
provide for a
Донбассом
special
в
status.
рамках координационного
Ukrainian
механизма,
side
предлагая
has
различные
taken
варианты,
course to
не позволяющие
completely
эффективно реагировать
move
на случаи
away
нарушения
from a direct
режима
interaction with
прекращения огня.
Donbass within the coordination
Попытки
mechanism.
переложить
And
ответственность
they
на
are
Россию,
providing various
выставить ее
options, but they
стороной
do not
конфликта,
allow for
несостоятельны
effective
и
reaction
не
in
имеют
case
под
of
собой
violations.
никаких оснований.
Attempts to place the blame
Не
on
могу не сказать, что
Russia
нас крайне
are
разочаровывает,
futile
как минимум,
and
страусиная
baseless, and
позиция
this
наших
only
западных коллег,
hides the goal of
пытающихся
shifting
не
the
замечать
blame
эти
away
очевидные
from
вещи.
Ukraine. I
Удивляет также, что,
must
уводя
say
в
that
тень
we
Минский
are
комплекс мер,
very
они
disappointed
делают
by the
акцент на работу
ostrich-like
на
position
алмазском
of our
формате.
Western colleagues who are
Хочу
trying
напомнить,
not
что на
to see
алмазский
obvious
формат,
things. We
согласно
are
приложению 2
surprised that they're
резолюции
putting into
2202
the
Совета
shadow the
Безопасности
Minsk
ООН,
complex of measures, but they
является
are
контрольным
placing
механизмом
the
по выполнению
emphasis on
Минских
the Norman
соглашений,
format. I'd
а
like to
отнюдь
recall the
не
Norman
форматом
format,
согласования
according to
новых
Annex
решений.
2 of the
На
resolution, is a
протяжении
mechanism
7
to
лет
control implementation, but
Россия
not
на
a
всех
place where
возможных
new
площадках
decisions could be
призывала
discussed.
западных
For 7
правителей
years,
Киева надавить
Russia
на
has
своих
been
подопечных
calling
для
in all
выполнения Минских
platforms
соглашений.
for
Вместо
the
этого они
Western
занимались полностью
sponsors
противоположным.
to exert pressure on
Растущее
Kiev
чувство
to implement the
безнаказанности
Minsk
и
agreements.
вседозволенности подстрекало
They were
горячие
doing exactly
Киевом
the
на
opposite. So
бесконечные
the
новые
increasing
отговорки
feeling
и
of
военные авантюры
impunity
против собственного
pushed the
народа.
Ukrainian
В
hotheads to
результате
new
мы
excuses
имеем
and
то,
military
что
adventures
имеем.
against their own people. And
Тысячи
this is
жертв
what we have.
внутреннего
We have
вооруженного конфликта.
thousands of
Многомиллионное
victims
население
of the
Донбасса
internal armed
по-прежнему
conflict.
выставляется
Many
чужим
millions in
в
Donbass
собственной стране.
are still
Против него направлены
presented
дулы
as foreigners
автоматов,
in their
снайперских
own
винтовок
country.
и
They
гаубиц,
have automatic
нацеленных
rifles,
ударными
sniper
беспилотниками.
rifles, howitzers, and
А украинские
strike
представители
drones
продолжают
targeted at
придумывать
them.
новые поводы, не
Ukrainian
выполнять свои
representatives
обязательства и отдавать
keep
приказы на
coming up
расстрелы
with new
мирного населения.
excuses not to implement their
Вы знаете, что такое
agreements and
аллея ангелов? Это мемориальный комплекс
order
в
to
Донецке
shell
в
their
память о
own
детях,
people. There is
погибших
an
от
alley
рук
of
украинских
angels, a
военных.
memorial complex in
Таких,
Donetsk
как
to
те, которые
commemorate the
погибли на
children
детском пляже
who
донбасского
died
города
at
Зугрес.
the hands of
13 августа
Ukrainian military.
2014 года он стал
Those who
мишенью
died
ВВС
at the
Украины.
children's
В результате
beach in
обстрела тогда
Zurgus
погибли
on the
более
13th of
20
August.
человек.
He was
Десятки
targeted by the
получили
Air Force of
ранения.
Ukraine. 20
Местная
people
жительница,
died,
24-летняя
dozens were
Анастасия
wounded.
Рубин,
A
была на том пляже вместе со
24-year-old
своим
Anastasia
двухлетним сыном
Rubin, a
Максимом.
local, was
Когда
there with
ВСУ
her
начали
son sun at the time when the Ukrainian Air Force started shelling the town from their multiple rocket launch system. One of the charges exploded right next to them. Everything was covered in blood and smoke and bloody bodies of children. This and other similar episodes were compiled by the Investigative Committee of Russia and the RT media in a compilation showing the Ukrainian military using prohibited means and our UN mission have compiled that and disseminated this to members of the Security Council. Please take a look at them, you'll be horrified by it. The Kiev's commitment to the complex of measures can also be illustrated by the abduction last year in Lugansk from the Joint Center of Convention Control of Andrea Cossack. Mr. Kinnunen, we would be very grateful if you could tell us about this episode. This is a treacherous event, and it is a direct violation of item 5 of the conflict measures, which prohibits the prosecution and punishment of persons in connection with the events in Donetsk and Luhansk. Colleagues, I would like to finally say that you will be able to resist the temptation to play to the cameras and will not make this meeting of ours into a circus, will not present here baseless accusations saying that Russia allegedly was going to attack Ukraine. I think we've had enough speculation on that, including the Security Council meeting on the 31st of January convened by the United States. We have long ago clarified everything and explained everything. And the announced date of the so-called invasion is behind us. So therefore, my advice to you is not present yourself in an awkward situation. I thank you for your attention. And now I resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Antony Blinken, Secretary of State of the United States of America.
Mr. President, this council was convened today to discuss the implementation of the Minsk agreements, a goal that we all share, despite Russia's persistent violations. These agreements, which were negotiated in 2014 and 2015 and signed by Russia, remain the basis for the peace process to resolve the conflict in eastern Ukraine. This council's primary responsibility, the very reason for its creation, is the preservation of peace and security. As we meet today, the most immediate threat to peace and security is Russia's looming aggression against Ukraine. The stakes go far beyond Ukraine. This is a moment of peril for the lives and safety of millions of people, as well as for the foundation of the United Nations Charter and the rules-based international order that preserves stability worldwide. This crisis directly affects every member of this council and every country in the world. Because the basic principles that sustain peace and security, principles that were enshrined in the wake of 2 world wars and a Cold War, are under threat. The principle that one country cannot change the borders of another by force. The principle that one country cannot dictate another's choices or policies or with whom it will associate. The principle of national sovereignty. This is the exact kind of crisis that the United Nations, and specifically this Security Council, was created to prevent. We must address what Russia is doing right now to Ukraine. Over the past months, without provocation or justification, Russia has amassed more than 150,000 troops around Ukraine's borders, in Russia, Belarus, occupied Crimea. Russia says it's drawing down those forces. We do not see that happening on the ground. Our information indicates clearly that these forces, including ground troops, aircraft, ships, are preparing to launch an attack against Ukraine in the coming days. We don't know precisely how things will play out, but here's what the world can expect to see unfold. In fact, it's unfolding right now, today, as Russia takes steps down the path to war and reissued the threat of military action. First, Russia plans to manufacture a pretext for its attack. This could be a violent event that Russia will blame on Ukraine, or an outrageous accusation that Russia will level against the Ukrainian government. We don't know exactly the form it will take. It could be a fabricated so-called terrorist bombing inside Russia, the invented discovery of a mass grave, a staged drone strike against civilians, or a fake, even a real attack using chemical weapons. Russia may describe this event as ethnic cleansing or a genocide, making a mockery of a concept that we in this chamber do not take lightly, nor do I take lightly, based on my family history. In the past few days, Russian media has already begun to spread some of these false alarms and claims to maximize public outrage, to lay the groundwork for an invented justification for war. Today, that drumbeat has only intensified in Russia's state-controlled media. We've heard some of these basic allegations from Russian-backed speakers here today. Second, in response to this manufactured provocation, the highest levels of the Russian government may theatrically convene emergency meetings to address the so-called crisis. The government will issue proclamations declaring that Russia must respond to defend Russian citizens or ethnic Russians in Ukraine. Next, the attack is planned to begin. Russian missiles and bombs will drop across Ukraine. Communications will be jammed. Cyber attacks will shut down key Ukrainian institutions. After that, Russian tanks and soldiers will advance on key targets that have already been identified and mapped out in detailed plans. We believe these targets include Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, a city of 2.8 million people. And conventional attacks are not all that Russia plans to inflict upon the people of Ukraine. We have information that indicates Russia will target specific groups of Ukrainians. We've been warning the Ukrainian government of all that is coming. And here today, we are laying it out in great detail with the hope that by sharing what we know with the world, we can influence Russia to abandon the path of war and choose a different path while there's still time. Now, I'm mindful that some have called into question our information, recalling previous instances where intelligence ultimately did not bear out. But let me be clear. I am here today not to start a war, but to prevent one. The information I presented here is validated by what we've seen unfolding in plain sight before our eyes for months. And remember that while Russia has repeatedly derided our warnings and alarms as melodrama and nonsense, they have been steadily amassing more than 150,000 troops on Ukraine's borders, as well as the capabilities to conduct a massive military assault. It isn't just us seeing this. Allies and partners see the same thing. And Russia hasn't only been hearing from us. The international chorus has grown louder and louder. If Russia doesn't invade Ukraine, then we will be relieved that Russia changed course and proved our predictions wrong. That would be a far better outcome than the course we're currently on. And we'll gladly accept any criticism that anyone directs at us. As President Biden said, this would be a war of choice. And if Russia makes that choice, we've been clear, along with allies and partners, that our response will be sharp and decisive. President Biden reiterated that forcefully earlier this week. There's another choice Russia can still make if there's any truth to its claim that it's committed to diplomacy. Diplomacy is the only responsible way to resolve this crisis. An essential part of this is through implementation of the Minsk agreements, the subject of our session today. There are a series of commitments that Russia and Ukraine made under Minsk, with the OSCE and the Normandy format partners involved as well. If Russia is prepared to sit with the Ukrainian government and work through the process of implementing these commitments, our friends in France and Germany stand ready to convene senior-level discussions in the Normandy format to settle these issues. Ukraine is ready for this, and we stand fully ready to support the parties. Progress toward resolving the Donbass crisis through the Minsk agreements can reinforce the broader discussions on security issues that we're prepared to engage in with Russia, in coordination with our allies and partners. More than 3 weeks ago, we provided Russia with a paper that detailed concrete reciprocal steps that we can take in the near term to address our respective concerns and advance the collective security interests of Russia, the United States, and our European partners and allies. This morning, we received a response, which we're evaluating. Earlier today, I sent a letter to Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, proposing that we meet next week in Europe, following on our talks in recent weeks, to discuss the steps that we can take to resolve this crisis without conflict. We're also proposing meetings of the NATO-Russia Council and the OSCE Permanent Council. These meetings can pave the way for a summit of key leaders in the context of de-escalation to reach understandings on our mutual security concerns. As lead diplomats for our nations, we have a responsibility to make every effort for diplomacy to succeed, to leave no diplomatic stone unturned. If Russia is committed to diplomacy, we're presenting every opportunity for it to demonstrate that commitment. I have no doubt that the response to my remarks here today will be more dismissals from the Russian government about the United States stoking hysteria or that it has no plans to invade Ukraine. So let me make this simple. The Russian government can announce today, with no qualification, equivocation, or deflection, that Russia will not invade Ukraine. State it clearly, state it plainly to the world, and then demonstrate it by sending your troops, your tanks, your planes back to their barracks and hangars, and sending your diplomats to the negotiating table. In the coming days, the world will remember that commitment or the refusal to make it. I yield the floor.
Я благодарю его превосходительство государственного секретаря США Антони Блинкена и приглашаю, предоставляю слово его превосходительству государственному министру по делам Европы и Северной Америки, Соединенного Королевства Великобритании и Северной Ирландии, господину Джеймсу Клеверли.
I thank you, and I thank the briefers for the information they've given today. The United Nations, the OSCE, and the mandate of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission continue to command our full support. The rights of all Ukrainian, whether they are in Kyiv, Lviv, Donetsk, Luhansk, can only be served by peace, diplomacy, and dialogue. I want to make absolutely clear the United Kingdom's support for the implementation of the Minsk agreements as endorsed by the UN Security Council Resolution 2202. That resolution reaffirmed the Security Council's full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. It remains the responsibility of all parties to implement fully their commitments and to seek a peaceful resolution to the conflict. In this respect, we condemn the actions taken by the Russian Duma to propose the Russian president recognize the regions of Luhansk and Donetsk as independent. This would directly undermine the Minsk agreements and must be rejected by the Russian authorities in line with the commitments that they have made. We welcome all efforts to support the process and to avoid escalation, including the role of the OSCE and the Normandy format. This remains our long-standing position. Mr. President, let us remind ourselves of the context for the Minsk agreements and the situation in which Ukraine finds itself today. In March 2014, Russia invaded and illegally annexed Crimea in flagrant violation of international law. A few weeks later, in April, Russia instigated a conflict in the Donbass, which it continues to fuel today. More than 14,000 people have lost their lives in the fighting there. Now, today, the Ukrainian people are yet again living under the threat of invasion, with well over 130,000 Russian troops, heavy weaponry, and military vessels amassed and exercising on their northern, eastern, and southern borders, from Belarus to the Black Sea. Let us say clearly what the whole world can see. Russia has deployed the forces necessary to invade Ukraine and now has them readied for action. In the past days, we have heard Russian claims that some units are returning to barracks. It is, however, all too clear that the opposite is in fact true, and the Russian military buildup continues. Russia will say that it has the right to move its forces within its own territory, but no one has the right to threaten the use of force. Russia is patently failing to live up to the international commitments that it has made around military transparency by refusing to adequately explain its military buildup or provide the necessary transparency to build trust and to de-escalate the situation. If the Kremlin is serious about a diplomatic resolution, then it needs to show up to the diplomatic meetings and commit to meaningful OSCE talks, including via Chapter 3 of the OSCE Vienna document. They did not show up on Wednesday, and they do not intend to show up on Friday. Russia's actions are clearly designed to intimidate, to threaten, and to destabilize Ukraine. We know it, they know it, and the international community knows it. Mr. President, Russia called this meeting today to discuss Resolution 2202. That text is very clear on 2 points that reflect the core tenets of the Charter emphasized by the United Nations Secretary General when he addressed this situation only a few days ago. One, that resolving the situation in eastern regions of Ukraine can only be achieved by peaceful means. And two, that there must be full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Yet, we are seeing increasing disinformation about events in the Donbass that are straight out of the Kremlin playbook, a blatant attempt by the Russian government to fabricate a pretext for the invasion of Ukraine. It is therefore clear that we are at a critical juncture to prevent further escalation. Upholding the core tenets of the Charter in respect of peaceful resolution and respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity has never been more important. Russia must now engage with the diplomatic process we have built up over several decades and on which global security depends, and resolve this situation through peaceful means. If Russia chooses to launch an attack at this time of heightened tension, using disinformation of a pretext, it will show that Russia was never serious about diplomatic engagement. Any Russian invasion now would be a conflict of choice for President Putin and an abdication of Russia's responsibility under the UN Charter to refrain from the use of force and to maintain international peace and security. There should be no doubt that any further Russian incursion into Ukraine would be a massive strategic mistake and a humanitarian disaster that will be met with strength, including significant coordinated sanctions. And we will continue to call out the pattern of deception and disinformation from the Russian state. But if Russia is serious about the Charter and its role as a permanent member of this Council, it should give the Minsk agreements the chance to be implemented, free from coercion. It should engage seriously with diplomacy, and it should stand down all of its troops. There is still time to change path. Conflict can be avoided, and we urge Russia to match its words with actions, to withdraw its troops, to engage meaningfully in talks, and to act in the best interest of peace and security and stability in Europe. I thank you.
Я благодарю его превосходительство господина Клеверли за его заявление и предоставляю слово представителю Норвегии.
Thank you, President, and I thank the briefers for their statements. Let me also use this opportunity to thank all personnel at the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine. They contribute on a daily basis to reducing tensions and fostering peace, stability, and security on the ground. The threatening security situation in and around Ukraine is alarming. Norway is deeply concerned by Russian large-scale military buildup in occupied Crimea to the north, east, and south of Ukraine, as well as in Belarus and the Black Sea. The alleged reports of increased shelling are disturbing. They must not be used as a pretext for any military action. Norway calls on Russia to de-escalate and to engage in dialogue constructively and in good faith through established international mechanisms. It remains a major obstacle that Russia falsely seeks to portray the conflict in eastern Ukraine as an internal Ukrainian conflict. The reality is that Russia has fueled the conflict by providing financial and military support to the armed formations it backs. President, Norway expresses strong concern regarding the resolution of the Russian State Duma calling for the recognition of the self-proclaimed People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. We warn against such a step, which would constitute a further violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and directly contradict the spirit and the letter of the Minsk agreements. Norway supports the negotiations in the Normandy format and in the trilateral contact group aimed at ending the conflict through a political settlement and implementation of the Minsk agreements. Norway calls on the parties to uphold their commitments and to engage constructively towards resolving the conflict by peaceful means. We welcome the OSCE chairmanship's renewed European Security Dialogue initiative. We encourage Russia to engage in this format. We also urge Russia to respect its commitments under the Vienna document and contribute to a constructive dialogue and exchange under Chapter 3. Norway upholds a European security order based on international law and national sovereignty and territorial integrity. These principles have repeatedly been invoked by Russia in Council discussions. Norway calls on Russia to respect these principles when it comes to Ukraine. President, through threatening posture and rhetoric and unrealistic demands, Russia is challenging European security. Every country has the right to freely choose its security alignment. We cannot allow the established security architecture to be replaced by spheres of influence. We're concerned that the ceasefire in Donbass from July 2020 has become increasingly fragile. We call on the parties to seek a durable ceasefire and do their utmost to prevent civilian casualties. The humanitarian situation is severe after 8 years of conflict. Civilians are increasingly losing access to essential life-saving services as civilian infrastructure is damaged and destroyed. Any escalation of the conflict would lead to devastating humanitarian consequences. Let me conclude by reiterating Norway's unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its international recognized borders in accordance with the principles and purposes of the UN Charter. This includes the Crimean Peninsula and its territorial waters. I thank you.
Я благодарю представителя Норвегии за сделанное заявление. И сейчас предоставляю слово представителю Бразилии.
Thank you. Mr. President, Brazil follows with concern the situation in eastern Ukraine. Persistent political stalemate and prolonged crisis have reached a critical point. In present circumstances, renewed and reinvigorated political resolve by all parties is crucial to address the conflict. Achieving and maintaining peace is our collective responsibility. We appreciate the ongoing political and diplomatic efforts aiming to restore peace and stability in Ukraine and the wider region. We firmly believe a diplomatic solution must be found to the crisis, and we will continue to support credible initiatives to bring a peaceful settlement to it. We reiterate our understanding that Resolution 2202 provides the general guidelines for a peaceful solution to the situation and a permanent stability in eastern Ukraine. Unfortunately, Resolution 2202 has not been fully implemented. Brazil urges all parties to fulfill the letter and the spirit of the Minsk agreements. We urge concerned parties to pursue genuine dialogue on the implementation of Security Resolution 2202, which provides the parameters not only to address the situation in eastern Ukraine, but also to assist diplomatic efforts to overcome the current security challenges in the region. Brazil also welcomes the resumption of talks in the Normandy format and calls for renewed commitment to find ways for a lasting peace in eastern Ukraine. A comprehensive ceasefire, which is the first point of the Minsk agreements, remains an essential element in this process. Beyond that, we need further disengagement of forces and military equipment on the ground. This disengagement must allow unimpeded access of humanitarian relief to people in most desperate need. Furthermore, trust among relevant parties is crucial to strengthening dialogue and achieving a sustainable solution. Negotiations on the parameters to grant special status to certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions must be conducted with a sense of urgency, flexibility, and a spirit of compromise. The implementation of the Minsk agreements must observe full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. All parties must bear in mind the letter of the agreements. We firmly believe that the Security Council has the utmost responsibility to avoid and condemn any attempt of a military solution to this crisis. Dialogue and negotiation are the only way forward to a lasting peace. We urge all parties to take the necessary measures to de-escalate tensions and play a constructive role in reaching a political settlement to the Ukrainian crisis in accordance with international law, particularly the UN Charter. I thank you.
Я благодарю представителя Бразилии за сделанное заявление и представляю слово представителю Ирландии.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I also want to say a special thank you to Under-Secretary General De Carlo and to Ambassadors Kinnunen and Cevic today for their helpful and informative briefings. And I'd like to also recognise the presence of high-level participants at this council this morning, Mr. President. As I begin my remarks, it's important that I'm clear. Ireland is a steadfast and consistent supporter of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognised borders. Ireland believes in and is fully committed to the core principles enshrined in the UN Charter. These include the sovereign equality and territorial integrity of states. Ukraine has the same fundamental right as every other sovereign and independent state to choose its own foreign policy and to ensure the security and defence of its territory. That is a right we hold to be self-evident. It's a right that Ireland struggled to obtain. As Russia's military build-up at Ukraine's border continues to raise tensions, Ireland again calls for calm, de-escalation, and the pursuit of diplomacy. We need to see sustained and credible moves on the ground toward de-escalation. Genuine de-escalation will imply a significant withdrawal of both troops and equipment. We commend all who are engaged in dialogue, including through the Normandy format and Poland as OSCE chair in office, for launching a renewed European security dialogue. We support urgent, constructive, and resolute engagement through all diplomatic channels. President, the full implementation of Minsk peace agreements and the related conflict resolution efforts in the Normandy format and trilateral contact group are important priorities for us. There is no doubt that we are now at a sensitive moment. Today, we call on all parties to act constructively within both formats. In this regard, we deeply regret the decision of the Russian State Duma to submit a call to recognize as independent entities the non-government controlled areas in the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts of Ukraine. This would be a clear violation of the Minsk agreements. We are also concerned at reports of alleged shelling today in eastern Ukraine, as mentioned by Special Representative Kinnunen, which would also be a violation of the Minsk agreements. Mr. President, all signatories of the Minsk agreements agreed on the need for the OSCE's special monitoring mission safe and secure access to the entire territory of Ukraine. The mandate of the SMM was agreed by all 57 OSCE participating states. We therefore remain very concerned at the continuing restrictions imposed on the SMM's freedom of movement. We also regret that SMM equipment has been damaged or interfered with. I want to express our deep regret at the decision by the Russian Federation to refuse to extend the mandate of the Border Observer Mission to monitor the border crossings. We commend the tireless efforts of Ambassadors Kinnunen and Cevic in the Trilateral Contact Group. We see the agreement reached by the group at the end of last year on adherence to the July 2020 ceasefire as an important achievement and a sign that there can be progress if there's genuine political will. President, Eastern Ukraine has already endured 8 years of conflict, resulting in humanitarian disaster, serious human rights violations, and abuses as reported by the OHCHR. Just as we know that further conflict is not inevitable, we know too that wherever conflict occurs, it is civilians who bear the brunt. Ireland therefore sincerely calls on all sides to work peacefully toward an effective and sustainable political settlement of the conflict, and to jumpstart that work today. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю
I thank
за заявление представителя
for her statement
Ирландии
to the
и
representative of
предоставляю
Ireland,
слово
and I
представителю
give the floor
Индии.
to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo, Special Representative Mikko Kinnunen, and Chief Monitor Yasha Chevik for their comprehensive briefings on the occasion of the 7th anniversary of the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreements endorsed unanimously by the UN Security Council Resolution 2202. I also welcome Ms. Tatiana Montian to our meeting. We welcome the efforts underway for implementation of the Minsk agreements, including through the Trilateral Contact Group and under the Normandy format. We believe that Minsk agreements provides a basis for a negotiated and peaceful settlement of the situation in eastern Ukraine. Accordingly, we urge all parties to continue to engage through all possible diplomatic channels and keep working towards the full implementation of the Minsk agreements. We also believe that meetings under the Normandy format will further facilitate the implementation of the provisions of the Minsk agreements, including its key security and political aspects. In this context, we welcome the recent meetings of the political advisors of the Normandy format countries in Paris and Berlin. We also welcome the unconditional observance of the July 2020 ceasefire, the reaffirmation of Minsk agreements as the basis of work under the Normandy format, and the commitment of all sides to reduce disagreements on the way forward. Any steps that increase tension may best be avoided by all sides in the larger interest of securing international peace and security. Quiet and constructive diplomacy is the need of the hour. India has been in touch with all concerned parties. It is our considered view that the issue can only be resolved through diplomatic dialogue. India's interest is in finding a solution that can provide for immediate de-escalation of tensions, taking into account the legitimate security interests of all countries and aim towards securing long-term peace and stability in the region and beyond. More than 20,000 Indian students and nationals live and study in different parts of Ukraine, including in its border areas. The well-being of Indian nationals is of priority to us. In conclusion, we reiterate our call for the peaceful resolution of the situation by sincere and sustained diplomatic efforts to ensure that concerns of all sides are amicably resolved through constructive dialogue. I thank you.
Я благодарю представителя Индии за сделанное заявление и предоставляю слово представителю Кении.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, the Special Representative of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission Chief Monitor for their briefings. Kenya cannot contemplate the continued insecurity in eastern Ukraine and the impact it can have on broader security in Europe. Global security is intertwined. Instability in Europe, beyond threatening lives and economies, also disrupts the ability of this important region to play a constructive role in solving the most pressing challenges globally. Insufficient progress in the implementation of the Minsk agreements has been realized since 2014, and that needs to change. Kenya wants to offer 3 brief recommendations. In doing so, we hope that they will contribute to a renewed push by all relevant stakeholders to stabilize a situation that, left to escalate, threatens the very foundations of global stability and the Security Council's ability to fulfill its mandate in multiple conflict situations. First, Kenya maintains that the respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of all countries by all states is a cornerstone of global peace. If multilateralism is to be reborn into a system that delivers sustained peace to all, the most powerful states must consistently adhere to international law and to the respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries in all regions at all times. We therefore strongly urge all actors to respect the peace, security, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. The people of Ukraine deserve inclusive governance, peace, and a vibrant economy, which are all deeply dependent on regional stability and cooperation. Second, as we indicated on the 31st of January in this chamber, we believe that this standoff is imminently solvable. Major military powers, particularly those represented in the Security Council, must make a specific and sustained effort to reach arrangements that deliver a minimum level of deconfliction and mutual respect. Otherwise, third countries and global peace and security will suffer greatly as a result of their confrontations. Third, Kenya reiterates the obligations of all the parties to fully implement their commitments in accordance with the Minsk agreements, which provide the most promising roadmap for the peaceful settlement of the current hostilities, including in eastern Ukraine. All parties must take responsibility and reflect that responsibility in a new willingness to agree to compromise. Kenya welcomes the Normandy Format Advisors meeting held earlier this month and the follow-up meeting, which is scheduled for next month, on implementing the Minsk Accords and the consensus reached at the Group Leaders Summit in Paris in December 2019. We commend the diplomatic leaders of the Russian Federation and the United States and their partners and allies for showing a willingness to meet in the coming days to make further progress. Thank you.
Благодарю представителя
I thank
Кении за сделанное заявление и предоставляю слово представителю Объединенных Арабских
floor
Эмиратов.
to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. أود بداية أن أشكر كل من السيدة روزماري دي كارلو وكيلة الأمين العام للشؤون السياسية وبناء السلام والسيد ميكو كينونن الممثل الخاص للرئيس الحالي لمنظمة الأمن والتعاون في أوروبا في أوكرانيا ومجموعة الاتصال الثلاثية والسيد ياسر حالة شرك رئيس بعثة الرصد الخاصة التابعة لمنظمة الأمن والتعاون في أوروبا على إحاطاتهم الشاملة. كما استمعنا إلى إحاطة ممثل المجتمع المدني السيد الرئيس منذ اجتماعنا الأخير في 31 من يناير شهدنا بذل المزيد من الجهود الدبلوماسية على مختلف المستويات بما فيها على أعلى المستويات لخفض التوترات القائمة في أوروبا الشرقية. كما نرحب بمحادثات نأمل أن تستمر. فمثل هذه المناقشات المنظمة ولا سيما تلك التي تجمع بين روسيا وأوكرانيا وباقي الأطراف المعنية مهمة لتعزيز الحوار وتخفيف حدة التوترات ومن شأنها أن تساهم في إيجاد حل سلمي مستدام يعالج كافة الأمنية وعلي تؤكد بلادي على ضرورة الحفاظ على الزخم الحالي للجهود الدبلوماسية وتعزيزها لا سيما من خلال اتخاذ جميع الأطراف المعنية الخطوات اللازمة للانخراط في حوار بناء بما يخدم وقف التصعيد ويحافظ على الأمن والاستقرار الإقليميين. ونرى هنا أهمية تنفيذ اتفاقات مينسك بشكل تام وبحسن نية من قبل جميع الأطراف ونشير كذلك لقرار مجلس الأمن 2202 وفي هذا السياق نحث جميع الأطراف المعنية على تجنب اتخاذ خطوات قد تزيد من صعوبة تنفيذ هذه الاتفاقات. كما نشير إلى الدور الهام لبعثة الرصد الخاصة إلى أوكرانيا التابعة لمنظمة الأمن والتعاون في أوروبا حيث يعتبر وجودها داعما لجهود الحوار وبناء الثقة بين الأطراف كما يسهم في تخفيف حدة التوترات. وفي الوقت ذاته علينا إلى أهمية وضع الحرج للمدنيين في شرق أوكرانيا حيث أفادت تقارير الأمم المتحدة أنه يوجد 3.4 مليون شخص بحاجة لتلقي
need
المساعدات
of
الإنسانية،
humanitarian
منهم
assistance, of whom
55% من النساء
55% are women
و16%
and
من الأطفال.
16% children.
كما توجد تحديات تتعلق
Furthermore, there
بإيصال
are
المساعدات
obstacles for the
الإنسانية
delivery of
لبعض
humanitarian
المحتاجين
assistance
لا
to
سيما
some
في
of those
المناطق
in need,
القريبة
particularly
من
in
خط
areas
النزاع
near
في
the
شرق
contact
أوكرانيا.
line in eastern
وعليه
Ukraine. We
نشدد على
therefore
أهمية عدم
emphasize the
التصعيد في
importance of
التوترات
not
القائمة
escalating
لما قد
existing
تلحقه
tensions,
من
as
أضرار
this may
خطيرة
cause
على
serious
المدنيين.
harm to civilians.
ونهيب في هذا الشأن
In this
بجميع
regard, we
الأطراف
call
على
upon
أهمية
all
عدم
parties
التعرض
not to
للمساعدات
obstruct the
الإنسانية
access to
وللمدنيين
humanitarian
في
aid
مناطق
or the
النزاع
movement of
بما
civilians in
يتماشى
conflict
مع
areas in
التزاماتهم
accordance with
بموجب
their
القانون
obligations
الدولي.
under international law.
وأخيرا نكرر
Finally,
التأكيد
we
على أهمية
reiterate the
احترام القانون
importance of
الدولي
respecting
وميثاق الأمم
international law
المتحدة
and the Charter of the United
وعلى
Nations,
وجه الخصوص مبادئ
particularly the
السلامة
principles
الإقليمية
of
والسيادة
territorial
وحسن الجوار
integrity, sovereignty,
باعتبارها
and good
مرجعا
neighborliness,
أساسيا
as they
لحل
are
الأزمة
essential
القائمة
references for
وتهدئة
resolving the
التوترات في
current
المنطقة.
crisis and calming tensions in the region.
وختاما
In
السيد
conclusion,
الرئيس
Mr.
تجدد
President,
بلادي
the
تأكيدها
UAE
على أهمية
reiterates the
اللجوء للحوار
importance of
البناء
constructive
ومواصلة
dialogue
العمل لإيجاد
and to
حلول
continue
سلمية
effort
تتسق
to
مع
reach
القانون
peaceful
الدولي
solutions
وميثاق
consistent with
الأمم
international law
المتحدة.
and the Charter of the United Nations.
وشكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю представителя
I
Объединенных
thank the
Арабских
representative of
Эмиратов
the
за
United Arab
сделанное
Emirates
заявление
for
и
statement,
предоставляю слово
and I'll give the
представителю
floor
Ганы.
to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'd like to begin by thanking USG Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing on the prevailing situation in eastern Ukraine as it relates to the implementation of the Minsk agreement, as well as Mr. Mikko Kinnunen, the special representative of the OSCE, chairperson in the office in Ukraine and the Trilateral Contact Group, and Mr. Yasser Halit Shevik, chief monitor of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, for highlighting the efforts of the OSCE in facilitating the political and diplomatic settlements of the the conflict in eastern Ukraine. We have taken note also of the views expressed by Ms. Tatiana Montian, a civil society representative from Ukraine. I further welcome the participation of the representatives of Germany and Ukraine in this meeting. Mr. President, in welcoming today's discussion, which enabled the Council to take stock of the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk Agreement, adopted on 12 February 2015, my delegation recalls the adoption of Resolution 2202, wherein the Security Council expressed its firm conviction that the crisis in the eastern regions of Ukraine could only be settled through peaceful means. 7 years after the adoption of Resolution 2202, the Council's obligation for the maintenance of international peace and security requires of it a reiteration of its conviction and support for the processes for the further implementation of the Minsk agreements. Unfortunately, the Minsk agreements remain largely unimplemented, and the conflict continues to fester in parts of the Donbas region, with increasing civilian casualties and deepening vulnerabilities, mostly of elderly persons and women-led households. More than 14,000 deaths have been recorded since the conflict in eastern Ukraine began. Several thousands of people have been displaced, and 2.9 million people are presently in need of humanitarian assistance. The implications of the situation in Ukraine on regional as well as international peace and security have also been dire. While recognizing the complex fears and complicated concerns which have been expressed by the parties through the Minsk agreements, we nonetheless believe that good faith conformity with charter obligations by concerned member states should provide clarity to seize opportunities for supporting continuing dialogue and the engagements required to address the concerns of all parties. In this respect, Ghana is concerned by the increasing tensions along the borders of Ukraine. We recall in this regard the provisions of the Charter which establishes the fundamental norms of the post-1945 international order and require that the international relations of member states should not involve threats of or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of other states. We therefore entreat all parties to maintain the path of dialogue and diplomacy in addressing any differences that exist between and among them. Towards the further implementation of peaceful measures for resolving the crisis in the eastern regions of Ukraine, we make the following points. First, Ghana reaffirms her support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, a bona fide member of the United Nations, whose membership of this organization provides for her guarantees over her internationally recognized borders. Secondly, we know the security concerns of other member states in Europe, especially those in Eastern Europe, and urge a restraint by all in maintaining the Pacific order in Europe, even as efforts continue to address any concerns with the contemporary European security architecture. Third, we welcome the high-level diplomatic engagements to address existing concerns over the situation in Ukraine, including recent discussions among leaders of the Normandy Four that reaffirmed the ceasefire in the eastern region of Ukraine, as well as the OSCE-facilitated dialogues at different levels. We continue to urge restraint by all sides, call on the parties to bear in mind the prospective outcomes from ongoing escalation, which do not lead to any strategic gain for any party, and encourage efforts to address both immediate and long-term interests through diplomacy and dialogue. Fourth, we urge renewed dialogue within the Normandy Four process to resolve differences in the interpretation of the sequencing of the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreements. As it is said, how can two go on a journey unless they be agreed on the path they intend to take? Fifth, we urge the parties to guarantee unimpeded access for humanitarian assistance in both government and non-government controlled areas in line with humanitarian principles and international humanitarian law. We further commend the efforts of humanitarian agencies in Ukraine and welcome the 2022 Humanitarian Response Plan to save lives, ensure access to basic services, and strengthen the protection of those affected by the conflict and COVID-19. Finally, Mr. President, let me conclude by stressing Ghana's support for the renewal of the spirit of the Minsk Agreement. We urge the parties to work in good faith and with flexibility to make necessary concessions for an enduring peace in Ukraine with beneficial outcomes for the rest of the Europe and indeed globally. I thank you very much, Mr. President.
Благодарю представителя Ганы за сделанное заявление и предоставляю слово представителю Мексики.
To the representative of Mexico.
Gracias, presidente.
Thank you, President.
Agradezco las presentaciones de la
I would
subsecretaria
like to
Di Carlo,
thank Undersecretary
del representante
General Di
especial
Carlo